I am the acting director for the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. It is my pleasure to have the Charlemos event, the first of two Charlemos events in November, Populism in the Americas. It will be moderated by Victoria Murillo, Kurt Weyland, and Steven Levitsky will also be participating. And for now, I just want to welcome again Victoria Murillo, who will be leading the moderation of this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the invitation to be here. I'm Vicky Murillo. I'm the director of the Institute for Latin American Studies at Columbia University, and it's a pleasure to moderate this conversation with Kurt Weyland and Steve Levitsky, who need no introduction, but still I'm going to do it. Kurt is a professor of political science at UT Austin, working on democratization and authoritarianism, social policy, policy diffusion, and more importantly for today's conversation on populism in Latin America. He's the author of many books. His last two books are Leftist Government in Latin America, Successes and Shortcomings, along with Raul Madrid and Wendy Hunter, and Making Waves, Democratic Contention in Europe and Latin America since the Revolutions of 1848, published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. Steve Levitsky is a professor of government at Harvard University and the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. He works on political parties, authoritarianism, democratization, weak and informal institutions with a focus on Latin America. His most recent books include the bestseller, When Democracies Died, with Daniel Ziblatt, published in 2018, and The Politics of Institutional Weakness in Latin America, co-edited with Dan Brinks and myself, published this year by Cambridge University Press. So I'm going to give each of them about 3 minutes to start with some remarks, and then we will start the conversation.
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this debate, which of course comes at a particularly exciting time because the whole topic of populism and democracy is very high on the US agenda. And I want to use recent events as the lens to shed some light on populism in the United States in comparative perspective to Latin America. Think about the following. What we are witnessing right now is the electoral defeat of an incumbent populist leader. And that is something that, to the best of my knowledge, has never happened in the Americas before. There has never been the defeat of an incumbent populist in a regular electoral process. In Europe, we've had some of those cases. So, for example, Vladimir Mečija in Slovakia in 1998, Berlusconi in Italy in 2006, Tsipras in Greece in 2019, but in Latin America, never, and in the United States, never. Nowadays, populists go in only two ways. One is the collapse of their government as their popularity plummets and they suffer impeachment, declarations of mental incapacity, forced resignation due to protests. Or they go because when institutions are comparatively strong, term limits are enforced and they cannot run again, like Cristina Kirchner, like Uribe. Those are the two ways that populist terms, governments end in Latin America. Unusual in the United States that we have a populist being defeated in a regular democratic election. And what that shows is there are two main reasons that show the underlying strength of US democracy in the face of a pushy, autocratic type of populist. One is strong opposition, a fairly strong civil society, comparatively high education level, prosperity, organizational strength in the United States, which limits the size of the poorer sectors that are usually the disproportionate base of populist leaders. In the United States, fortunately, you don't have that many deplorables who usually support populists. The civil society is comparatively strong. Second factor, paradoxically, the very polarization of the United States political system puts a limit on the support that Trump could ever win. There is no chance to win the 70–80% mass support that Fujimori or Chavez won in Latin America. It's limited by this polarization. So polarization is a big problem for American democracy, but it is also puts a limit on the support that Trump could win, and it allowed the opposition to achieve that strength. So that's one factor, the strength of the opposition, the strength of civil society. Second, the strength of institutions in the United States, the strength of electoral institutions, the strength of other institutions. And that's important because it provided the incentive and opportunity for the opposition to Trump to work through regular democratic elections, not through protests like the opposition in Venezuela that didn't get very far, but you work through regular democratic institutions. And that's very important to explain why Trump is losing unusually as part of a regular election. Those two factors also are related to the underlying strength of American democracy and the obstacles and the limits that Trump has faced throughout his government. So the big fears that people had that Trump would do serious damage to US democracy, that populism could overpower democracy, have not come true for those two reasons. So that then leads us to the next point, which is now, hopefully, Trump will go into opposition and not try to hang on to his government in whatever kinds of ways. And so that raises the question how populists act in opposition. That's not that common either, because the populists who fall by the wayside, who collapse, usually their movements fade. But we have seen in Latin America a number of populist movements that were in government for a longer time, or that formed especially strong identity links to their supporters. So Peronism in Argentina, the MAS in Bolivia, Chavismo in Venezuela would be part of that, even Fujimori in Peru. And what you see is those populist movements hang on and they try to make a comeback. They do not, unfortunately, fade and disappear. And so I'm afraid that's what we have to expect from Trump, that he will continue to try to maintain his followership, going to try to cause trouble for the Biden government. But there might even be a little blessing in disguise, because the pressure from Trump might induce the fractious Democratic broad coalition to stick together to maintain its centrist orientation and to make sure that Joe Biden won't even have a more difficult time governing. So that's the introductory statement with which I wanted to start the discussion. Thank you.
Steve, now you have your time.
Okay, first of all, thanks to Manuel and Vicky and Kurt. It's great to be here with you. Kurt and Vicky are two of the scholars of Latin American politics whom I most admire in this world. So it's an honor to be here with both of you. I wish I had volunteered or insisted on going first, because I'm going to retread a bunch of things that Kurt said. Let me try to disagree with him a little bit, but I'm not going to very much. But let me do a little bit to place the U.S. case in comparative perspective. I agree with Kurt that Trump's ascent to power in 2016 very clearly fit the pattern of Latin American populism. Here you had a personalistic outsider who made a pretty unmediated appeal to the people against the political establishment. And Kurt and I agree as well that populists do tend to threaten liberal democracy. Successful populists are usually political outsiders, poorly socialized into the norms and practices of democratic politics, inexperienced with the give and take of democratic politics, things like negotiation and coalition building. And most importantly, populists are elected with a mandate to crush the elite. They are elected essentially with a mandate to take a wrecking ball to what they have described as a corrupt and oligarchic establishment. The problem is, and we saw this in the US, is that the old elite that populists have been railing against usually occupies quite a bit of power in representative institutions, whether it's Congress, the courts, the media. And that creates a dilemma for almost every successful populist president. To sit down and to negotiate with the old elite that you've been railing against is a betrayal of your populist mandate. And that is politically very costly. So populist presidents have an incentive, even though it's often risky and damaging. Populist presidents have a political incentive to continue their assault on the old elite, which usually leads to some sort of assault on existing Republican institutions, on Congress, on the courts, on the civil service. The result of that is almost invariably some degree of institutional crisis and some degree of democratic backsliding. We saw this with Trump. I disagree a little bit with Kurt in that I think that in 4 years, given the strength of US democratic institutions, Trump did a fair amount of damage to US democracy, particularly in the area of purging and packing key government agencies and converting them, or trying at least, to politicize them and convert them into partisan weapons against his opponents. Most global democracy indices show an erosion of American democracy since 2016. Even Freedom House, a very pro-US institution, in 2020 considered the United States less democratic than Chile, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Taiwan, Uruguay. But Kurt's right. This is relative to cases like Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela. This is a case of unsuccessful populism. This is an incumbent populist who is defeated. Bunch of reasons for that. Kurt pointed to I think, some of the most important. US institutions continue to be considerably stronger than those in the Andes. Courts continue to be independent. Federalism is robust, and we have a really strong civil service, right? So within every government agency that the White House tried to pack, effective civil servants fought back. They didn't always win in the end, but they slowed the process of democratic rule. Another force constraining Trump was the strength of the opposition, whereas populist autocrats, Fujimori, Chavez, Correa, steamrolled a weak opposition. The US had a unified opposition, well-organized, well-financed, and electorally viable. That's critical. Finally, finally, I get to say something that maybe Trump, that Kurt didn't entirely say. The Trumpist coalition is fundamentally different, I think, from many populist coalitions in Latin America. Trump's populism is ethno-nationalist and exclusionary. So whereas populists like Perón, Chavez, Fujimori, Morales appealed very broadly to the poor against a small oligarchic elite, Trumpism only appealed to certain Americans, what it deemed real Americans, in effect, primarily white Christian Americans. That placed a real ceiling from the very beginning on Trump's electoral appeal. And this gets to Vicky's question about whether populism has to be popular. In Latin America, I think arguably populism has to be popular to succeed. Populists in Latin America face too many obstacles. The vast bulk of the financial, political, cultural capital in the country is stacked against them. All they have, to exaggerate a little bit, is numbers. So they have to be able to mobilize majorities. What we call populism in the United States and Europe, which is almost invariably ethno-nationalism, is pretty different. Ethno-nationalist movements in the United States and in Europe are overwhelmingly concentrated in rural areas, which works to their electoral advantage due to both legislative malapportionment and to the efficiencies of vote distribution. So thanks in effect to rural overrepresentation, ethno-nationalists in Western democracies can win or can exert quite a bit of power without building national majorities. This is especially true in the case of the United States, where the Electoral College and the Senate heavily favor the Republican Party today. In the United States, the Republican Party has lost the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 elections, and yet they still managed to control the presidency for 12 out of 20 years. So whereas Latin American populists tend to be hyper-majoritarian, which almost invariably threatens the rights of political minorities, the ethno-national forces that we call populists in the United States and Europe are more likely to push in the direction of minority rule. So both forces threaten liberal democracy, but they do so, I think, in very, very different ways.
Thank you. This is great, and it brings me to 2 other questions. Do you think that it really builds on the way that Steve ended in? So what are the threats to liberal democracy from these 2 different kinds of populism that you describe? And it seems to me that the ethno-nationalist, as you call it, but the more right-wing populism, it's also present in people like Bolsonaro in Latin America. It's not unique now anymore to Europe and the United States. But what kind of threats do the left and the right, or the ethno-nationalist and the popular, as you describe them, put to liberal democracy in your understanding of populism, excuse me, as a political strategy? And for both of you, I guess.
So I see the threat posed by populism as very common across the different versions. And I think that we have seen recently 3 different versions: that ethno-nationalist one that is more limited and exclusionary, the left-wing Bolivarian one. But then also there was a whole wave of neoliberal populists in Latin America. And I think they all have in common that inherent tension with liberal democracy that comes from the two main characteristics of populism. One is this powerful personalistic leadership of these populist chieftains who want to have concentrated power, autonomy, and who therefore inherently see institutions, checks and balances, liberalism as a limitation. And then this connection to mass followers that are fairly heterogeneous in all these versions of populism. And so the linkage that these populist leaders have, it's not organizational, it is not party discipline. Instead, it is essentially quasi-direct and personalist. And what that means is that a populist personalistic leader feels compelled to increase the intensity of that linkage. And you do that essentially by turning politics into a war, by saying that I'm the savior of the people, there are these dangerous, corrupt elites and enemies, and I have to save the people. So you turn regular democratic competition into a fight to the end, into a war, and that is by nature damaging to democracy. And so I emphasize the commonalities of this threat that populism poses to liberal democracy. I mean, there are some differences, the greater exclusion of minorities, of immigrants in the ethno-nationalist version, but what I see is a lot of commonalities, efforts to bend and break checks and balances, efforts to transform institutions, wherever these people and whatever type of those three types of populism they belong to, I think there are these inherently authoritarian tendencies that populism has.
Steve, before you go in, I think that what just Kurt says goes contrary to some literature that like Ken Roberts and Santiago Andrea and your own book on Peronism suggests that some populist movements do have organizations. And so it doesn't seem to me that this is what really the direct link between the leader and the masses. That seems to me it's not enough of an explanation, because there's lots of populist movements, not all of them, that have proved to have very strong organizations and strong enough that they survived the death of the leader. That's true in the case of Peronism. The leader died in 1974. Evo wasn't run in the last Bolivian election, and still they got a majority. So I'm less persuaded by this leadership example. I don't know if you have other ideas here to tell me what are the problems of populism for liberal democracy.
Well, I mean, there are very few ideal typical cases of populism. And there are political organizations that use elements of populism in their appeal, but they're still nevertheless well organized. I think Kurt's point is fundamentally correct, that populists almost invariably tend to be two things. Really, the first one by definition, they're anti-elite, which almost invariably leads to a struggle, a conflict with other branches of government, because without quite a bit of electoral shift.
Sorry, that's true even of the neoliberal populists that Kurt mentioned, like Uribe and Menem. Do you see those as anti?
Right. I don't want to go down this path because we don't always agree on who's a populist and who's not. I'd rather stay at it. Let me finish my thought here. Populists do tend to be anti-institutional, and they do tend to be illiberal, and they tend to be anti-elite. And that's true of right-wing populists and left-wing populists. We can quibble about who's one and who's not. But I agree with Kurt that populists of diverging ideological flavors tend to be similar in this sense. Couple of additional points though around the edges. First of all, I think we have a tendency these days to conflate populism and illiberalism. If we conflate populism and liberalism, then populists are by definition a threat or antagonistic to liberal democracy. And that's a little bit too easy. It is not, so almost all populists, I think all populists tend to be illiberal, but not all illiberals are populists. I think liberals of the center left, like me, and liberals of the center right, like The Economist, anything that we don't like and that we find is sort of annoyingly illiberal, we tend to call populist over the last decade or so. And I think that's not always right. Vladimir Putin is not a populist. The BJP in India is, I think, much more ethno-nationalist than populist. So, ethno-nationalism, I think, threatens democracy in a different way than populism, for the reason I said before, whereas straight out populism almost invariably threatens the liberal component of democracy most urgently, the minority rights, political rights of minorities, whereas ethno-nationalist projects, whether they're populist or not, tends to threaten the universal citizenship element of democracy, which is just as much a threat to democracy, but it's a different one. It tends to push people out of the political arena.
Okay, let me ask another question before we move also to read the Q&A. And this is, under what conditions do you think that these populist strategies emerge? Do you think that they're more likely under conditions of growing inequality, under particular institutional settings, under conditions in which certain cleavages prevail over others? I mean, I was struck by Kurt's mention of the deplorables. And I think, you know, the classism of the term cost certain votes to Hillary, and that has still been the problem of the Democratic Party. But so what conditions in society would make a populist strategy more likely to success? So those are the questions. That's the question. And why don't you start, Steve, and then Kurt?
Okay. So let me start with the demand side. The vast bulk of explanations out there, scholarly and other, of populism focus on the demand side. Why voters are so pissed off that they vote for populists. And this is important. The demand side is important. I think for sure inequality is a factor. I think, as Ken Roberts in his recent work has pointed to, and others as well, the failure of political representation is very, very important in the advanced industrialized countries. I guess Sherry Berman is another person who's really focused on this explanation. You know, since the early 90s, center left and center right parties in the advanced industrialized countries had converged around two key issues, right? Support for globalization, embrace of globalization, and at least tolerance of immigration, if not support for it. And those are, I'm in favor of both those policies. They have majority support in many democracies, but there's a pretty good sized chunk of the population that didn't like those policies and felt completely ignored by the political elite across Europe and the United States for 30 years. So that sort of failure of that partisan convergence by establishment parties also contributes. I think in Latin America, state weakness, I've argued this elsewhere, I think state weakness plays a central role. The inability of states to deliver basic public goods, no matter how well-intentioned they are, their inability to provide public security, their inability to provide public education, public health, fill the potholes consistently, where governments of various tribes consistently fail to provide basic public goods, you get the kind of anger and frustration with the entire political elite that you don't as easily see elsewhere. All of that said, I think there is an understudied or underexplored supply side to the success of populism in the contemporary period. And I'll say this very briefly because we don't have much time, but political establishments are much weaker than they were 50, 75 years ago. Think of political establishments as the set of actors and institutions with the resources that politicians need to gain election. 50, 75 years ago, think about interest groups, media, political parties who control the nominations. You go back to the mid-20th century, and unless you were Perón, it was really hard to get elected without the support, without nominations from mainstream political parties, without money from big labor and big business, without access to a very small number of mainstream media outlets. And so that created a very strong incentive for politicians to defer to at least to not run outside the bounds, both programmatically and behaviorally, of establishment norms. And it's just much easier to be a political outsider today than it was 75, 100 years ago. We're in a world where Bernie Sanders can raise as much money as Hillary Clinton. We're in a world where Jair Bolsonaro can get elected via WhatsApp rather than TV Globo. And I think that just makes it much, much easier for politicians who would have fallen by the wayside 70 years ago to get elected today.
Okay, Kurt?
So if I can add something to Steve's very important points is, in my view, there is no general account of the reasons for the emergence of populism. I mean, I see populist leaders as very opportunistic and very savvy and very skillful, and they essentially take advantage of different types of opportunities. And so Steve mentioned a number of the underlying factors that create representation problems, that create discontent, that create this feeling of exclusion that then a populist leader uses. But there are a number of specific factors that play a role here. So for example, with a neoliberal populist, there was crisis, hyperinflation, security crisis. So conjunctural factors like a big crisis can create an opportunity for a populist leader. There are other issues like essentially more identity-based sense of exclusion. There are issues of value change. I do believe, for example, that the Engelhardt and Pippa Norris argument about the cultural backlash plays a significant role in the United States, in the UK. And so I'm struck by the diversity of reasons or bundles of factors that accounts for the emergence of populism. I don't think there's sort of a general argument. I think there are different types of factors, and as a result of that, sort of different paths to populism. So that's what I wanted to add.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question that is kind of bringing three of the questions in the Q&A to the scene. And so the question is about the future of Trumpism in the United States. And Jennifer McCoy, I think, asks pretty convincingly, I agree with her, that Trump might have lost, not because of the great, institutions of the United States, but because of COVID. And without COVID, like, in January, an incumbent president with a growing economy might have been reelected. So that, to what extent you're really giving too much emphasis to that explanation. And on the second one, she also asked if there might be something else going on, like a coalition of economic elites with cultural appeals to ethno-nationalism, and others like Stefano Palestini have also suggested that Trumpism might be something, beyond Trump in the Republican Party. You can think of, going back to 1994 of Gingrich. That was already a populist move in the Republican Party. So to what extent is this something that's going to endure in the Republican Party, and to what extent really where we say by, the strong American institutions that, look pretty dysfunctional, or by COVID?
So one thing that has struck me about Trump and Trumpism in the United States is the tremendous persistence of his popular support. I mean, when the impeachment came up, I thought somehow or other this would do damage to his support, and it didn't do very much at all. And I think with COVID, it's quite similar. I mean, when you think his approval rating has pretty much hovered around 40, 42% persistently throughout the last year. And so I wondered about that myself. Is it a conjunctural problem that led to Trump's defeat? Maybe given how narrowly divided the United States is, maybe ultimately that was the case. But I think the polarization in this country is so deep, and the identity attachment that the followers have to Trump is so intense that, I mean, everything is filtered through polarization, right? I mean, one party wears masks and the other party doesn't wear masks. One party writes of COVID and the other one doesn't. And so I'm not really sure whether how much impact this exogenous shock has had. I'm impressed by how persistent and how kind of more or less at a constant level Trump's support has been. The future of Trumpism, I mean, you're very optimistic in thinking about populism in the United States after Trump. I'm afraid we're going to have to live with Trump for a while to come. This guy is not going anywhere. He will try to hang on. He will try to make a comeback in 2024. And if not, then he's going to try to promote his daughter or whatever. So, and I mean, Trump, as scholars, we have to say there's something kind of impressively savvy and clever about that guy. I mean, for somebody who lives in a golden tower to make millions of Americans believe, who are in totally different life circumstances, that he is their spokesperson and he represents them. There's something ingenious about that. And then the very, we all kind of chuckle at these Twitter barrages, but what that has allowed him to establish in an almost prototypical way, that quasi-direct personal appeal that I think is so important for populism. I mean, 80 million Twitter followers, and every day he's creating his own show for them, and he's connecting to them, and he's feeding them his conspiracy theories and his viewpoints. He's kind of entertaining them. I mean, that kind of linkage that Twitter has allowed him to create with so many millions of people is really, I mean, there's something very inventive and innovative about that we have to admit this guy has come up with. And that's the reason why I don't think he's going to fade. I'm afraid we'll have to live with him, and Joe Biden has to live with this guy for a long time to come. And I don't see the Republican Party at all as, coming up to a renovation where they say like Trump fuera, because, we have to reorient this party. We are in a cul-de-sac by emphasizing too much this narrow Trumpian base. I'm afraid that he's maintaining that grip on the party, which you see right now. Who has come out and congratulated Biden? Who has come out and said, forget your shenanigans, forget about all these stupid lawsuits, let's just concede. They're all, ooh, Trump and his grip over this space that could create primary challenges. So I think he's going to be around for a while to come.
So very quickly, because I'm not going to disagree too much with Kurt. I think it's true what Jennifer McCoy says, that Trump probably did lose due to COVID. I think it was at least only because of voters at the margin. Kurt's absolutely right that Trump's approval rating barely changed. But COVID probably did cost Trump the election. But I don't think that takes away from Kurt's basic point, which is that Trump was a very vulnerable and very unsuccessful populist compared to those that we've studied in Latin America. I mean, the guy's approval rating never exceeded 44%. And that's not something you could say about Fujimori or Correa or Erdogan or Chavez or Morales. I agree that Trumpism will endure. There is a populist base out there, or a constituency for populism out there. It's true that we've seen it since the 90s. I think Gingrich was a pioneer, and he's one of the first Republican politicians who sensed that anger and sensed that there was potential support for radicalization. We saw it with Palin. We saw it very clearly with the Tea Party. And at root, my belief is that this is at root being driven by the fact that we have a white Christian majority in decline that feels deeply, deeply threatened by the changes going on in the society. And that's going to continue. One other factor I would add to what Kurt said, in addition to Trump's personalistic appeal, I think I don't see him as quite as savvy as Kurt does. But the other reason why the Republicans are unlikely to change is electoral institutions. The electoral institutions, the fact that the Electoral College, the Senate, and because of the Senate, the Supreme Court, are all biased towards sparsely populated territories, means that the Republican Party can win and sustain a lot of power without winning national majorities. They've just got to get 46, 47% of the electorate. If you strip away those institutions, if we had strictly majoritarian electoral institutions, the Republicans needed to win 50+1% of the vote to win, you would see today much greater pressure on the Republican Party to adapt. But our electoral institutions dull the incentive of the Republican Party to adapt. And so I come to the same conclusion. They're unlikely to do so.
So it's interesting, though, that in your conversation, I mean, there's someone who asked a question about the role of social media, something that both you and Kurt mentioned. But when you talk about the Republican Party, and I'm going to push about this a little bit, you talk about the evangelicals, which I think here to their pastor, they don't need to go to Twitter. and the Tea Party and other organizations that have been important for the Republican Party. There's a lot of work now on the strength that on how much the Republican Party had invested at the state level since the 1970s. And that brings me to the issue that many populist movements seem to have survived out of power. I mean, not just Peronism with Perón in exile, but Evo Morales, his party just won an election, being out of power and in exile in Bolivia. It does seem to me that there is something more than Twitter and social media. So the question is, what's the role of social media? And you need to, so that's the question from the audience. And you need to persuade me that really social media plays such a different role, or that it might be better for some of the populists. Maybe for the ethno-nationalists, it works better than for the more left-wing or popular-based populism.
I mean, I think the role of social media can be overstated. I think it's pretty abundantly clear that relative to, let's say, half a century ago, social media helps marginal political candidates reach voters and potentially win elections in a way it was unthinkable 50 years ago. I mean, I was in Brazil in 2018 and in Sao Paulo talking to a number of business leaders, all of whom supported Alckmin. This is several weeks before the first round. Alckmin was in single digits in the polls. All of them were convinced they were not worried about Bolsonaro, because they were convinced that Alckmin, because of his alliance with the Central, had so much more TV time than Bolsonaro that eventually he would catch up and drown Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro had 6 seconds a day or something of allocated TV time. They clearly underestimated the role of social media in reaching in Bolsonaro reaching voters. And so, Bernie Sanders' ability, or any individual's ability to raise money online completely changes the game as well in terms of fundraising. So politicians can now get resources enough to reach entire electorates and compete at the national level without getting into bed with the establishment, and that facilitates populism. Now, cases like, so for sure, populist movements can survive in opposition. I think in many of those cases, including Peronism, Vicky, these are former populist movements. These are movements that were born of populism, but that eventually take on a different character. The MAS used a populist appeal to get Evo Morales into power for sure, but the MAS was more than that before 2005. It was a social movement-based party. It was always a well-organized party. It continues to be a well-organized organization that happened to use a populist appeal. So sort of pure cases of Kurt and I do both tend to emphasize the personalistic component of populism. Pure cases of individuals without organizations, it's hard. Those guys are less likely to endure in opposition. But many cases that we describe correctly as populist are hybrid cases, or are cases of either populist governments that built strong organizations like Chavismo, or organizations that are more hybrid cases that took on a populist appeal like the MAS.
So to add something to Steve, I mean, social media is just the most recent communication technology. I think it was no accident that populism in Latin America in the 1930s started, 1930s and 40s, when radio became ever more widespread. And like Michael Conniff has emphasized the importance of radio for Getulio Vargas. And then you had the neo-populists of the 80s and 1990s, you had TV, I think, being very important. And so social media is just the most recent kind of instance where you see new communication technology playing a significant role in the rise of a new wave of populism. And I think what you have is that these populists, in their eagerness to connect directly in that quasi-personal way with the masses, are often pioneers in the usage of these new types of technologies. And so they beat the political establishment. They can, they're first to use these kinds of things. And so I think that communications technologies and kind of innovation on that front plays a significant role. But I think Steve is absolutely right that it can be overrated because, I mean, think about it. To the present day, Donald Trump is cruising around the country to hold in-person meeting. He's dying despite COVID to bring the masses out there to take that bath in the masses, rile himself up, rile them up. And so you see, despite these modern communications technology, the sort of impression of a face-to-face contact. I mean, it goes back to the old charismatic leadership. You know, in the Middle Ages, people wanted to touch the king to kind of participate in that charisma. So the personal connection. And so you see, even in this very modern age, you know, personal rallies are still part of the whole populist kind of effort to reach the followers and the masses.
Okay, I'm also going to bring like 3 other questions into one. So you guys have mentioned the civil service, I guess the deep state, as one of the reasons that Trump was, you know, stopped. And one of the questions asked about the role of the civil service, and also the fact that the conversation has really pivoted around electoral outcomes, but Trumpism, or whatever you want to call it, was pretty successful in hollowing the state and in appointing a lot of judges, which are part of the state. So maybe if we look at policy, you know, we have a different picture of populism. And I thought that was a pretty, you know, interesting aspect, because the populist movements in Latin America have often seek to change the state personnel, or to, you know, enlarge the state, to increase the personnel. Historically, Peronism, you know, forced, you know, state bureaucrats to be members of the party. So certainly state employees, state personnel, an important part of the story, and we have been centering on elections and not talking about what's the relationship of populism with the state once it gets to power, not a state weakness that brought it to power. So Kurt, you start now, and then Steve.
So what's interesting there is, and it's a big difference to the to Latin American cases, that you do not have in the United States this empleomania that these populists just appoint, like, you know, tons and tons, thousands and thousands of cronies, and really pack the state and politicize the state. As, I mean, in the United States, it's just not feasible. It's done not nearly as much as in the Latin American cases. I mean, Hugo Chavez totally took over the Venezuelan state, appointed thousands and thousands of cronies, totally politicized, destroyed state institutions like PDVSA and the ministries and whatever. Trump has done a good amount of damage, but even that is limited in the United States due to civil service norms, due to simply the much more limited appointment powers that US presidents have. I mean, when you think like Bolsonaro in Brazil can appoint like 17 to 20,000 top-level state officials, US president simply does not have that. And so I think even there, while Trump has done a good amount of damage, I think it is much, much less than in the Latin American cases due to the strength of US institutions.
Steve.
Again, I think populists have a very strong incentive to pack the state. When you win an election with a mandate to take the old elite and just take a wrecking ball to that elite, you are, one, going to polarize. You're going to be very fearful of existing state officials, no matter what agency they're in. The Trump's deep state rhetoric. Chavez didn't use the term deep state. Fujimori didn't use the term deep state, but almost every populist has a very, very similar attitude towards existing state officials. They are the enemy. They are conspiring against me. They're trying to keep me from doing my job, from solving the problems of the people, and we need to go after them. And we saw it with Trump. Now, I agree with Kurt. The U.S. civil service is much stronger, and there was less sort of empleomania in the case of, largely because rules don't permit it in the United States. But Hugo Chavez had 13 years to pack the Venezuelan state. Trump had only 4. I think I was very fearful of what the U.S. state would look like, what the U.S. state bureaucracy, what previously effective and independent government agencies would look like in the United States after 8 years of Trump. Trump, frankly, did more damage to state agencies, independent state agencies, than I anticipated when he was first elected. I think that's in part because of his populism. I think it's also partly that Trump is really sort of an old style neo-patrimonial ruler. He really does. I mean, he's more Trujillo than Perón, right? He really does see the state as an extension of him. He believes that every state institution should do his personal bidding. I think he truly believes that. And he wasn't able to. He was occasionally able to get the Weather Service to change its hurricane forecasts in the southeast. That was a sort of particularly
the Sharpie.
Well, right. So I mean that's Trump. That it's obviously harder for Trump to do than it was for Duvalier or Somoza, but it was a very similar instinct.
I have
can I add something to that?
Sure.
To reinforce Steve's point by comparison to Latin America. What's interesting, when you look at recent Latin American cases, despite their attacks on the state, despite their insistence on personal loyalty, despite their big patronage appetite, a lot of these recent populist leaders surprisingly also try to rely on, in some areas of policy, on technocracy or the military, because they knew they had to administer something, and they thought of technocracy and the military in some sense surprisingly as controllable instruments. You select your technocrats and they do the job without getting into politics. The military, you just boss around. And so what you see in the Latin American cases, and it was populists of the left and of the right, both Fujimori and Correa in Ecuador used and built and strengthened technocrats and built technocratic institutions. So Fujimori destroyed a good part, he destroyed the party system, he destroyed a good part of the state, but he built the economic areas of the state. And similar, Correa and Ecuador. And then you see both Chavez and Bolsonaro relied big time on the military because they need somebody who does the bidding and the projects that they want to have done. And so you see the ridiculous thing that the health minister in Brazil is a general who has no idea about health. And so, interestingly, Trump hasn't done anything of that in Latin America, despite their distance from and fear of the state. Surprisingly, populists have actually in some specific areas built aspects of the state. So a big difference to Trump.
Okay, so let me ask a quick question for you to maybe a minute each or two, because we're running out of time. And this is going to, it's one of the questions from the audience. It's going to go back to electoral strategies. If you are going to pursue an electoral strategy in the US, the clear swing electorate that there's a lot of, and it's been 2/3 Democrat and 1/3 Republican, is Hispanic electorate, right? And that links the US and Latin America. The current exit polls suggest that this 1/3 that went for Trump, it's more male than female. It seems to be, I don't know if I buy it, this idea that they want a strong leader, that they also are pretty happy that he doesn't like Maduro and Cuba. So what would a populist US leader, if the Republicans want to follow that route, either with Trump or without Trump, has to do to get a larger share of this Hispanic vote? So that's my question to finish to both of you, like a couple of minutes to each. Who wants to go first?
Look, I think it's pretty tough. There's been a lot of celebrating in Fox News circles about how diverse the Republican Party base has become and how they're now a rainbow coalition, and all this stuff about white nationalism is out the window because they got 1/3 of the Latino vote rather than the traditional 25 to 30% of the Latino vote, and appear to have scared some folks in South Florida into believing that Biden is a Castroite socialist. But I think that the core of the populist appeal in the United States is ethno-national. I think there are lots of other populist appeals. There are lots of other appeals. There are lots of ways that the Republican Party could appeal to Latinos. As a socially conservative party, there are many, many ways. But as a populist strategy, I think the route the Republican Party is on is white nationalist. And these extra percentage points of Latinos are largely extraneous, and Latinos will not be a significant part of that coalition going forward. I've been wrong before in my predictions, but
I have to admit that I'm really not a specialist on that population group, so I have little to add to Steve. I can see that some appeals that can be considered part of populism, law and order. There are all these protests and they smash the store windows and whatever. So law and order could play a role among some of the Hispanic population. And then, of course, also the cultural conservatism, this Engelhardt.
But that's not populism. Cultural conservatism is not populism.
Yeah, but it can be used by a populist leader to say, you have these elites that try to shut you up by political correctness and you can't speak. And finally I think that's a big part of Trump's appeal. Finally have this guy who just doesn't care and says what he thinks. And that finally gives me, who has been, I haven't been able to say what I really feel. And this guy sort of liberates me and allows me to say these things too. I think there's a big part of the Trumpian appeal that he was willing to defy these self-appointed cultural vanguard that tried to oppress the people with its political correctness. And finally, somebody can say what we really feel and what we really want. And we don't want these kinds of things. I think that is part of populism. The big personalistic leader who is transgressive, who defies cultural elite and who speaks for the people who so far had to be kind of intimidated and didn't feel that they could express.
Kurt, let me disagree a little bit with you. The 60% of Florida voters who decided the vote, Trump won in Florida, voted in favor of increasing the minimum wage. So I doubt that the people, you might disagree of their understanding, but I think there's something there. And, 2/3 of California voters supported Biden, and yet the majority of them voted against affirmative action, working rights, for Uber drivers, or lower, extending rent control. So I think there is a population there that's up for grabs. I'm not sure exactly which party will get it, but it's my impression that there's more there than social and cultural appeals. It's just my impression. And I'm really thankful to both of you for what has been a fantastic conversation. And I hope it's the same. I didn't get to ask all the questions. There were all too many, but I asked a bunch of them, 6 of them. So I'm sorry for those of you whose questions I didn't ask. And thanks again to Steve and Kurt for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you for the opportunity to exchange ideas.